Reserves and resources are very important concepts in crude oil exploration, development, and production industry. The oil and gas companies assess the reserves and resources to understand the value of their asset portfolios. The regulators who monitor the activities of the oil and gas exploration and production companies also evaluate the values of reserves and resources that are quoted by the oil and gas companies to understand how optimally these companies are conducting their exploration, development, and production activities. The regulators also monitor the values of reserves and resources quoted by the oil and gas companies in their annual financial reports to ensure that investors who buy the stocks or bonds of these companies are not deceived by fraudulent figures. So, some of these are the important ways that reserves and resources are applied in the oil and gas exploration, production, and the corresponding financial markets. To understand more broadly the concept of reserves and resources, we're going to look at some other concepts like the total oil initially in place, undiscovered resources, and discovered resources. The total volume of oil initially in place in the subsurface is called total oil initially in place. Out of these, some may have already been discovered through exploration activities of oil and gas companies, and these are called discovered resources. If the resources have not been discovered yet, then they are called undiscovered resources. The exploration activities of oil and gas companies that are currently ongoing or will be launched in the future are meant to target the yet undiscovered resources in the subsurface. Here we focus on the concept of discovered resources so that we can drive down to the understanding of reserves and contingent resources. The total volume of oil already discovered can be called original oil in place. Some portion of the original oil in place cannot be technically recovered due to the constraints of the physical principles that govern the movement of fluids in the rock system. This portion of fluids that cannot be recovered is called unrecoverable resources. The other portion are recoverable resources. Under the recoverable resources, some portion can be technically recovered but are not economically viable at the prevailing oil price and other macroeconomic variables. This portion that can be technically recovered but not economically viable are called contingent resources. The portion that can be both technically recovered and also economically viable at the prevailing oil price and other macroeconomic variables is called reserves. Some portion of the original oil in place may already have been produced, and this portion is called production. These are the four key concepts that will aid understanding of where reserves, resources fit into the original oil in place. The insert on the right is consistent with this understanding. It shows that the economically recoverable fluid, which is the thick black line, represents the reserves. It's less than the technically recoverable portion, which represents the resources, and the resources less than the original oil in place because some portion of the original oil in place cannot be recovered, which is the unrecoverable resources. Recoverable resources, even though they are technically recoverable, cannot be developed because there are some contingencies that still have to be resolved before the development can be declared economic. So, most of the time, the projects are declared not viable, they are put on hold or pending until those contingencies have been resolved. Some of the contingency types that are usually encountered could be related to economic variables like the oil price is not high enough to make the development viable economically. It could be legal issues still pending to be resolved. It could be regulatory, dealing with issues like environmental impact assessment. It could be market access, non-availability of ready markets for the crude oil, and political factors where uh, government and regime changes or attitudes of different governments can be high risk to certain developments. So until these issues are resolved, the development of these resources cannot go ahead, and therefore they are called contingent resources because the development of these fields or assets are contingent on resolving some of these constraints that are making them non-economically viable. Reserves represent the amounts of crude oil that can be technically recovered and also economically viable at the prevailing oil price and other macroeconomic variables. There are two basic types of reserves, proved and unproved. The reserves can also be classified based on the level of certainty about the amounts of crude oil that can be actually recovered relative to the estimate at the time. So we have proved reserves, which has about 90% chance or more of actually producing the estimated potential production volume. So based on this percentage, this reserve type can also be called P90 reserves. The next is the probable reserves. This represents the sum of the proved plus any unproven reserves that may have at least 50% chance of producing the estimated production volume. Based on this percentage, the probable reserve can also be referred to as the P50, and it can also be called the 2P reserves because it incorporates the proven plus the probable reserves. The next is the possible reserves, which represents the sum of the proven, the probable, and any additional unproven reserves that has a likelihood of producing about 10% of the estimated production volume at a time. The possible reserve can also be referred to as P10 reserve or 3P because it incorporates the proven plus the probable plus the possible reserves. Reserves are very important in exploration and production industry. It represents the key value metric for the activities of the oil and gas companies. The reserves tell how well the companies are performing. The reserves and resources may also be quoted in the financial reports, and shareholders look at the reserves and resources metrics to understand the value of the stocks that they hold. Also, bondholders also look at these metrics to understand how good the E&P companies are and if they should lend money to these companies. So, this concludes our session on crude oil reserves and resources.